This morning, we're going to continue in this series that we've been in, and this is a series in which we've been looking very closely at the life of Jesus. Really what we've been doing is trying to dispel some myths around who Jesus is, around Christianity. At the same time, I think we're also confronting some of the misconceptions that people have about Christians. Some of those misconceptions are ones that were well-deserved, which we're going to see today. Some of those are misconceptions that maybe aren't deserved. But the point is that as we've looked at the life of Jesus over the last couple of months in the book of Matthew, what we've been seeing is that what Jesus is about and what Jesus was describing is far more than what we ever imagined as Western Christians living in America today. And it's fascinating to see how much Jesus simultaneously, as he was presenting this new way of living with God, was also very concerned about our reputation. It's kind of an interesting theme that comes up. Jesus seems to really care about our reputation, and I find myself kind of aligning with the heart of Jesus on this one. I really care about our reputation. I'm not just speaking of Summit. That actually gets me excited when I think about things like this last week. That's an exciting thing, and I love that. But when I talk about our reputation, what I'm describing is our reputation as Christians. I care deeply about the reputation that Christians have, that Christ followers have in the world today. And I care because so many times when I'm talking to people who are outside the walls of the church, or people who are disenfranchised with Christianity, or people who don't believe in Jesus, so many times what I discover is that the reason for their disenfranchised attitude, the reason for this distance from Christianity or this resistance, the reason is taken back to a person over and over again. You listen to people's story, and time again, there's somebody connected to something somewhere where something happened, and it's the people of Jesus, not Jesus, that individuals struggle with. And I think it's really important that we get honest about that we own that even ourselves and say, we can give Jesus a bad reputation. When I hear the things that get said by people that represent Christian groups or Christian organizations, I cringe because of what it says about our reputation. When I go online on social media and I see people post things on Facebook and make comments and spread videos, and those comments are filled with hatred and judgment and criticism and anger and bitterness, it makes me sick to my stomach, because every single person who's not a Christian sees that and says, yep, exactly, that's what I thought they were. I care about our reputation. I care about what we're known for. When you can't distinguish a Christian or a Christ follower from everybody else in a political climate like the one we're in, there's something wrong, right? There's something wrong if we can't distinguish between the Christians and everybody else. If the hate speech and the dialogue all sounds the same, then something's broken. And here's what's interesting about this reputation thing. That's why there's a reputation problem, because even people who are far from Jesus, they know this. They know that if the words of Jesus are true, then his followers probably should look different. Which is why we have a reputation issue. Because they know, listen, if the stuff that Jesus says is true, if that's really genuine, then our lives should look different. And here's something that I want you to understand, kind of where we're going to start today, and you'll see where this leads. But the message of Jesus is validated by the reputation of his people. Are you with me on this? The message of Jesus, the truth of his words, is validated by the reputation that we have. The message of Jesus is validated by the peace that we bring. It's validated by the joy that we exhibit. It's confirmed by the love that we share with others. It's the kind of people that we become, the change and the transformation that takes place in our lives over our lifetime. All of those things validate the message of Jesus. I know there's one part you go, well, wait a second. Don't put that on me, right? You're telling me that my reputation is Jesus' reputation? That seems like kind of a heavy load, right? In fact, that actually seems contradictory, because that does seem heavy, right? Our collective reputation validates Jesus, that seems like a heavy thing to put on us. And when Jesus said, my burden is light, not heavy, it would seem like that contradicts this, right? Doesn't it seem to? And it could be construed in a way that says, well, our reputation is more about things that maybe Jesus doesn't care about than what he does care about. Our first assumption is that we need to clean up our act, that what we're saying is, well, we need to not make any missteps, that if we stumble, if we say something inappropriate, if we tell an off-colored joke, if we didn't show up on time to work, somehow these behavioral things, we give Jesus a bad reputation. Like, you better be on your best behavior or else, that kind of thing. We can draw that sort of conclusion. But here's what's interesting. When Jesus addresses the reputation of his followers, it's not in the way that you think it would be. He talks about something that's really unexpected. And let me just say this. At the end of this, I think you'll see that this burden that he's giving us is actually really light. And so if you have your Bible, I want you to turn to Matthew chapter 7. If you have a device or physical, real paper Bible, whatever it is, Matthew chapter 7 is where we're continuing in the Sermon on the Mount. And I just want to begin today by reading this because I want you to just catch it all together. It's really kind of an interesting thing. Jesus is preaching. There's a group of people that have gathered around him to hear about these words of life that he's offering. And then he says this, "Judge not that you be not judged. For the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use it, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that's in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that's in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye when there's a log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Do not give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you." So here's what we have here. Jesus is talking, he cares about our reputation, and he gives us this short paragraph about judging, and then he talks about specks and planks, and then he talks about dogs and pigs and pearls. And I hope you're asking the same question that I ask when I read this, and that is, what does this have to do with anything, right? Like, is this connected? Are these just like random? Is like Jesus just like free-form preaching here? Like, it's just like, like what's the extreme of consciousness? It's just talking about stuff. I mean, or is this connected? Well, let me just start at the top. We'll start walking through this. Verse 1, he says, "Judge not that you be not judged." Which, by the way, in America these days, that's one of the most quoted Bible verses ever, right? It's kind of funny. Like, when do we quote this, though? I call this the escape clause verse, right? Because the only time this ever gets quoted is when you've messed something up, right? And like people are coming at you, and you're like, "Hey, judge not, lest you be judged," right? Is that what Jesus was giving us? Jesus was like, "Hey, I want to give you something that will allow you to never be held accountable for anything in your life," right? Just keep everybody at arm's length by making them be afraid that they're going to be judged by others, right? Is that what Jesus is saying? Judge not, lest you be judged. Don't make a judgment. Don't say anything bad about me because I'm my own person. You're your own person. Like in our individualistic society, this hyper-individualism that we live with today, this is a pretty significant way of thinking. But is that what Jesus was doing? Remember, he's talking to his followers about a reputation thing. But what Jesus is addressing here is actually a human being thing. And what he's saying is this. He's saying, I don't want my followers participating in this very common human behavior. This thing called judging. He's saying, listen, people judge. It's not just religious people. People judge. I think there's this tendency to think, well, Jesus was just like looking into the future and knew what we were going to turn into as his followers, and so he spoke to this. No, Jesus is saying, listen, in the heart of every human being is this judgmental spirit, this way of judgment that comes out in all of these different areas of life. And he's saying, listen, I don't want you to be a part of this judging. Now, the real question has to be then, well, what is Jesus saying when he talks about judging? What does that actually mean to not judge somebody? What's he describing there? Because there's a lot of confusion, right? Because then you could just say, well, I guess everybody, let's just celebrate anarchy because nobody can be wrong about anything if you can't judge, right? So what is Jesus actually saying? Well, here's what's fascinating. The word that Jesus uses is translated from the original language as this word. It's the word krino. Say that one with me real quick. It's krino. There you go. Krino is the Greek word. Here's what's interesting about the word krino. In just the New Testament alone, that word is used in 3 very distinct ways. And so I just want to show you the 3 ways that it's used, and then we can guess at which one Jesus is attempting to use it. Here they are. The first one is found in Titus chapter 3, verse 12. This is the first one I'll show you. Titus chapter 3, Titus is a book written by Paul to another individual, and he's just like closing up a letter, and he says this. He says, when I send Artemis or Tychicus to you, do your best to come to me at Nicopolis, for I have decided to spend the winter there. In other words, he krinoed to spend the winter there. So krino, this word krino means to decide. It's used in this context to decide or to distinguish or to discern something, to resolve something. So basically you would say this is to make a decision about something. So is Jesus saying, I don't want you to make a decision? Well, no, because you'd have to make a decision not to make a decision, which would mean you were making a decision. You see where that goes? Some of you will get that a little later, right? Right? No, he's not saying you can't make decisions. That's a contradiction. So he's obviously not saying that. So let's look at John chapter 18, verse 31. John chapter 18, Jesus is on trial before Pilate. And this is what Pilate says. Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and judge him, krino him by your own law. And the Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. Pilate said, krino him according to your own law. In this situation, he's referring to a court of law. He's referring to standards and norms. He's talking about cultural codes, and he's saying to measure somebody against those sort of codes. He's saying, you want to krino him? Well, krino him according to your laws. Compare him to your laws. That's what you're doing here. And so this second reference is referring to a courtroom setting and to judge something in that courtroom justice sort of way. And so is Jesus saying to us, well, I want to do away with justice? That would completely contradict the whole work and ministry of Jesus, right? So the third use, look at this one. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4 and 5. He says, for I am not aware of anything against myself. This is Paul writing, but I am not thereby acquitted, for it is the Lord who judges me, the Lord who krinos me. Therefore, do not pronounce judgment, krino, before the Lord comes, who will bring light to the things now hidden in darkness and will disclose the purposes of the heart. Then each will receive his commendation from God. So Paul says to krino nothing before its time. Don't krino, don't judge anything before its time. And this third use that he has here, there's 2 distinctions. Krino is something that God does, and then krino involves exposing the darkness or the motives of a person's heart. Saying this is who that person is. It's making a final judgment on them. And now go back to Matthew chapter 7. Which of these 3 is Jesus speaking of? The third one, right? He's speaking of the way that we have this tendency to evaluate and critique and draw conclusions about other people. To say it one way, to judge is to raise yourself up by lowering another person. It's this evaluation and decision that raises you and pushes them down. Maybe you could say it this way. To judge is to confuse action with essence. To judge is to confuse a person's actions or activities with their identity and who they are. See, when we judge in this krino kind of way that Jesus is talking about, he's saying, listen, when you judge this way, you're making statements, conclusions about who a person is because of something that they've done or something that they've said or a belief that they're holding at a particular time. They did this. They performed this way. They went and said these words, whatever it is, and we make these judgments about people. We draw a conclusion about them. And so rather than a person like doing something that was either stupid or foolish and us saying, well, that was really dumb, but I know that's not who you are. We see them do something or say something or believe something, and we say, I cannot believe the kind of person that you are. I can't believe who you've become. Or we turn them into a villain, and we say, everything about you is opposed to me. That's what Jesus is talking about. He's saying we take minor moments, we take times when they've messed up, we take differences that they may have, and we use those things to draw conclusions about the essence of who they are, and in doing that, we dismiss them. Some of you have experienced this on the other side, haven't you? When you think about it from your perspective, it's a lot easier to understand. Because if you're like me, you've probably done something stupid. For me, that I don't have to go further than like the last 3 days, right? So we've all done something stupid. Have you ever done something really dumb, like you go, man, like something where you think, I would never do that again. Like if I was in the same circumstance, I would never make that same decision. Like you journaled about it, you wrote it down, maybe you like got a tattoo for it, whatever. Like like if I was in that same situation, I would never do that again. And here's what happened. Whenever you've done that, and those of you know exactly what I'm talking about, whatever decision it was, whatever thing, you look back and go, that was really foolish. When you look back on that moment, one of the first things you think of to yourself is, why did I do that? That isn't who I am. Ever thought that thing? Right? That isn't who I am. Isn't it amazing how easily we can say that about ourselves, but we struggle with saying that about others? Like we look at ourselves and we extend this grace and we go, why did I do that? That was foolish. That isn't who I am. I would never do that again, even though we do. But then we look at others and we go, I can't believe you did that. What kind of person are you? Some of you know what it was like to have individuals in your life when you made that decision. And it might have been a really wrong decision. It might have been a really bad thing. You might have done something that was really not appropriate. You might have done something that was illegal. But you knew it wasn't you, and yet at the same time, was there somebody in your life that just laid on the guilt? Was there somebody who just seemed to extend judgment, where this thing, whatever it was that you did, they made this about who you were? Like they were blinded by the behavior. They were blinded by the belief. They were blinded by whatever you did at that time, so much so that you became identified with that. And there was this sense, and those of you that have been there, you know this, there was this sense as they judged you, like they were shoving you down, and in the process, they were raising themselves up. Are you with me on this? That's what Jesus says we do. We move from actions to value statements about identity. And I want you to understand this about you, and I want you to understand this about the people that are in your life. I want you to know this about your kids, and I want you to know this about your parents, and I want you to know this about your coworkers, and I want you to know this about the people that have political views that are different than you, and people that have religious views that are different than you. I want to remind you of this, that people are not the sum of their actions. You aren't. Neither is anybody else. Jesus is challenging in this because we have a tendency to do this, because this is human nature. Our tendency, think about a mom or a dad when a kid does something wrong and somehow they take whatever that child does personally. What's going on there? Well, they take it so personally because their child has become something because of a behavior. We have a tendency to do these sorts of things. We have a tendency to look at people who we don't know, who express a political view in a 30-second soundbite, and we make a judgment about who they are without ever even meeting them, because we believe that they're the sum of their actions. See, we have this tendency to do this, and Jesus says, no, I'm sorry. In this one case, I'm going to exclude you from this. Why? Why are we excluded from this? Because we don't understand how God loves and values everybody. The radical, lavishing, unconditional love of God barely makes sense to us, right? I mean, isn't it difficult to fully grasp and fully understand the grace of God and how it applies to you? Then when we go to try to extend that to others and we just try to see things as God sees, it is so incredibly clouded and difficult and muddy and murky. And Jesus has no expectation that we would see people who are different than us the way that God sees them. We can't. We can't even understand his love for people who are radically different than us. But secondly, he does it because we don't understand their story. How many times have you had one of those moments where there's something that takes place and you hear about it and you're like, oh man, what's going on? And then you start to hear a person's story, like something unravels, maybe they get in trouble, but then you start listening and there was this story about the house that they grew up in. And then something that took place in their high school years, and then there was something that happened when they were in college, and then there was a job situation, and there was someone that did this to them and did that, and you look, and all of a sudden, whatever it is you saw in the moment, you go, oh, it makes sense. You know what I'm talking about? Everybody has a story. Everyone has a story, and so seldom do we understand the nuances and the uniqueness of individual stories. I remember one day I was riding in the car with my daughter and we saw a young man walking down the street, and this young man I've known for a long time, and he tends to get in a little bit of trouble. And I was driving in the car and I looked at my daughter and I said, he's actually a good kid. And she kind of chuckled because he usually gets in trouble. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, well, I have this tendency to look at where he's starting, not where he is today. And where he's been and where he's come to is a whole lot further than a lot of people who had a big head start ahead of him. I think sometimes that's what God's asking us to understand, is that there's a story that's going on behind the scenes. And so he says, don't judge, don't make an assessment about them, because the story's still going. It's still happening. See, our attitude, the attitude that you and I have towards other people, the attitudes, the internal attitudes, is the climax of the Christian faith. That's the pinnacle. The attitude. And I think that's why when I see posts and I watch stuff on TV and I hear things that Christians say, that's why I get so upset, because our attitude reflects more about our faith than anything else. Our attitude, not just the way that we treat people, not just what we say to people, but our internal attitudes toward other human beings is the climax. And Jesus in this moment is making a massive statement regarding our attitudes towards those that are different than us. There is no one that we're justified in hating. Nobody. That is the way of Jesus. The way of Jesus says, you don't hate. If you're my people, you don't hate. There are no distinctions. Everyone is your neighbor. How many parables, how many stories, how many times did Jesus have to go on and on about this, saying, listen, I know that everybody else draws distinctions. I know that everybody else hates. I know that everybody else sends emails and does posts and writes blogs and gets on TV, but my people don't do this. It means we love people that we bump into, some people that rub us the wrong way. It means that people that actually upset us, people that disagree with us, we actually love them. Even when they're opposed to us, Jesus says, my people, there is something that's different. And even when they oppose you, you don't cast a judgment. You don't draw a conclusion about who they are. That is not your business. Jesus says, judge not, that you may not be judged, verse 1. And then in verse 2, he says, for with that judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use it, it will be measured to you. And by the way, this is the closest that Jesus ever gets to karma. Because what he's saying is that, listen, if you're that kind of person, if this is the world that you live in, if you create a world that is rigid and judgmental and finger-pointing, and you're drawing conclusions, he says you will build this around your life. You'll do this as an individual, but he's also saying to a group of people, if this is the way my people live, you will build this around your life, and eventually, as my people and as individuals, you will start to run into the walls, and you will be miserable. You'll start to hear people say, well, you Christians are so judgmental. And then you'll say, wait a second, isn't that judgmental, calling me judgmental? And the cycle begins. Because if that's the world you choose to live in, that just builds and swirls. And we get to see it every day. And it doesn't taste good, it doesn't smell good, it doesn't look good, does it? This judgmental context. So Jesus says this, and then he follows this with this section about planks and specks. which in the middle of this, he shows us the cure for being judgmental. Verse 3, he says, why do you see the speck that's in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that's in your own eye, or the plank that's in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye when there is a log in yours? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. I think when Jesus first said this, maybe people laughed. I think Jesus had a way of using humor, because this is what Jesus was basically saying. He's like saying, hey, listen, you do this. Like you walk around, I should take my glasses off, right? Like you walk around like this, and you go, hey, man, can I help you with something? Like you've got something here, and you're like smacking people around, like, let me help you get this thing, right? And you're walking around and you're doing this, and you guys don't think it's as funny as they did, but this was funny to them. This was good theater. This was good humor. Jesus is saying, listen, you walk around with this thing in your eye, and you realize, like, the ridiculousness of it is so evident. Like, Jesus is trying to lighten the mood and saying, listen, don't be judgmental, because this is what it looks like when you're judgmental. You're walking around, and you're picking out things in other people, and you're ignoring these things in your own life. Why would you do this? You do this thing, and it gets in the way of your relationships. It gets in the way of your life. It messes things up. And what Jesus is doing here is he's bringing this whole thing back to us. He's bringing it back to the gospel. The reason that we get judgmental, the reason that we cast judgment, is that we just keep forgetting what he's done for us and what he's doing in our lives. He comes back to the gospel because in the gospel we understand our brokenness. He comes back and says, remember this? Remember? Like, quit looking at other people, and would you just remember who you are? Remember the brokenness that you have in your own life? I'm broken. And I'm accepted, and I'm loved. And that changes me more than anything else. Jesus says, if you understand that, if you go back to looking at you and remembering and thinking and watching, there's going to be change in you. And you'll start to believe that if God can do those things in you, he could probably do that in the lives of other individuals. I want to be clear here, though. He is not saying that we shouldn't care. And he's not telling us not to get involved, but he's saying that there's a relationship. You can actually become the kind of person who does help. But it comes when you do the hard work of removing the plank from your own eye. When you actually stop and say, what kind of person am I? It begins when you start to search your own heart and your own life. And you start to notice those things. When you start to remove those things, Jesus says, then, when you start to address, when you're in the process of addressing your own stuff, then if there's something else in somebody else's life, that seems appropriate. Notice there's a relationship, though. I love this. There's a relationship. What Jesus is describing is a plank that's in our eye, and he's describing a speck that's in our brother's eye. And he says, remember the plank, and then after you've remembered the plank, whatever you talk to your brother about, make sure it's smaller than the plank. Are you with me on this? As you approach another individual, do you acknowledge that you are far more broken than whatever it is you're talking to them about in this moment? Are you with them in the brokenness? There's a different relationship here. In fact, in this situation, we're not elevating ourselves and shoving them down. In this situation, we're elevating them and saying, listen, this is who I am. This is where I've been. This is what's been going on in my life before we take the speck out of their eye. You can't make anybody do anything. By the way, I am yet to see anybody convinced of something that they disagreed with because of a Facebook post, or a billboard, or a debate. Like, I'm yet to hear somebody say, man, I was living this way and I was headed down this path, but I was badgered so much that eventually I just knew that God loved me. Like, I was just hated on and argued with and screamed at. Like, can I just say, like, an exclamation point has never made somebody, like raising your voice and yelling never makes anybody change their mind, right? At least not in the way that you want them to. If you want to help someone, start with your own brokenness, and then we'll get somewhere. That's what Jesus says. And so he talks about the plank, and then he has a second story, which I think is interesting. Jesus has just said what I think is music to our ears, in our modern culture. Don't judge others, don't condemn, don't write people off. And then he turns around and he calls people pigs and dogs. Do not give the dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, for lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you. Pearls before swine. I talked about this before, I think like a year and a half or so ago, and I brought my pig in again. Those of you that have been around Summit a while, you know about my pig that flies, because pigs do fly. And every time I read the story, like ever since I was like old enough to like read this story, I just always imagined this pig, and like, is this really that big of an issue? Throwing your pearls before swine, was that much of a thing that like Jesus had to talk about that? Like, is that a common practice? Were people walking around in Jesus' day just like throwing pearls before swine? He's saying, stop it. That's a ridiculous practice, throwing pearls before swine, right? Is that what he's doing? I think it's good for us to know that that wasn't something that happened every day. Jesus is just drawing a point. Again, he's using some theater. He's being funnier than I am maybe to them in that moment. But he's saying, listen, the pearl is a good thing. I want you to catch this. Here's why I want you to catch this. I want you to catch this because I think there's probably half of you in the room have somebody in your life that you would love to see make a change in where they're going, right? I mean, if you're someone that loves somebody, if you care for somebody, there's probably someone in your life that you want to see them take a different path. Probably half of us in the room could name somebody that we wish they would just listen to us and do what we're telling them to do, right? Most of those are our kids, but listen to this. Listen to what Jesus is saying. That pearl is a good thing. That pearl's a good thing. But a pig or a dog has no use for a pearl. And Jesus isn't insulting people by calling them pigs and dogs. He's just drawing the distinction. You have pigs and you have pearls, and they live in two totally different worlds, don't they? And if you give a pig a pearl, what is it going to do with it? Nothing, right? It'll eat it. I don't know what a pig will do with a pearl. It's not going to make a necklace. It's not going to give it to you for Christmas. A pig has no use for a pearl. The pig's just going to say, well, what do I do with this? What do I do with this pearl that you've cast before me? It doesn't make any sense. Why wouldn't you give me what I need? See, this good thing, this pearl, it might be incredible wisdom. It might be something, it might be a hope that you have for someone. It might be the love of Jesus Christ. It might be a life filled with joy and peace. Whatever that good thing is, what Jesus is saying is that good thing can become a bad thing when it's thrown in front of the wrong person, when it's thrown in front of a person who senses that you're condemning them, that you're judging them, a person who feels like you're pressing them down. He's saying, listen, you can't make a pig recognize a pearl. How many times have you seen a situation, or maybe you've been in a situation where somebody's trying to shove something down another person's throat, and you know it's good. Whatever they're shoving is good, but the more they shove, the more that person seems to just walk away and get resistant. It doesn't devalue the pearl. Just because somebody doesn't take what you're offering them doesn't mean it isn't valuable. It's still beautiful. It's still a pearl. But if you take God's place, that pearl is not going to look like a pearl to anyone. You're just going to find yourself in this relationship that Jesus describes as being devoured. It'll just get ugly. What is this about? Well, this is about us entrusting people to God. This is about us trusting God working in their lives. And what Jesus is saying is, listen, I love everybody, and I want you to do the same thing. Like, Jesus says that the most important thing in our life is to love God with everything that we have, and then do what? Love others in that same sort of way. Love God with everything. So Jesus actually intertwines those two. Loving God and loving others. It's not always easy to love the people around us. And sometimes we're going to strongly disagree with people's political views. By the way, we're going to disagree with people's religious beliefs. And we're going to disagree with people's behavior. But here's what's beautiful and liberating about what Jesus says. When you begin to discuss those things, imagine if those people start realizing, oh, you haven't made a characterization about me. You haven't judged me. Just because we disagree doesn't mean you've drawn a conclusion about who I am. Imagine how liberating and life-giving that becomes. In a culture where people oftentimes say this, right? If you disagree with someone in our culture, you're saying, well, you reject me. If you don't take this part of me, if you reject my behavior, then you don't accept any of me. You're disregarding me. What happens when now we look at people and say, but you're more than the sum of your actions. Who you are is more than just your behavior. And so I'm not rejecting you. I'm just disagreeing with you. Because I know what it's like to be wrong. So do you realize how liberating it would be if there was a group of people who gave others the same benefit of the doubt that they gave themselves? You are not the sum of your actions, and neither are they, no matter how much you disagree with them. So when you do that, when you love somebody that you disagree with, there is something special that happens. There's something amazing that takes place when you become the kind of person who draws crowds the way that Jesus did, by giving life and peace and joy rather than spewing judgment and condemnation and hatred. So maybe the best way that we show our love to God is by actually loving them no matter what they've done or how they behaved. Because isn't that the statement? To draw this into this season, is that not the statement that the birth of Christ makes? That God loves us regardless of what we've done or where we've been or how we've been opposed to him. Let's pray together. Jesus, I don't question the radical nature of your message. It is absolutely clear that what you call us to is distinct and it's different and it's challenging and it calls us out of patterns and behaviors and habits that we formed over years of living. But Lord, you know that not only does this make us the kind of people who give you a great reputation, but this also is a burden that is so light. For us to be relieved of the responsibility to judge the heart, the motives of another person, to us be relieved of the urge to draw conclusions and make decisions about who people are. Lord, that is a burden that is light. And it's a burden that allows us to love the way that you've called us to love. Lord, I pray that we would be people that walk in that. In your name I pray. Amen.